A millionaire nearly swerved off the road when he noticed a young woman sitting on the sidewalk with two little twin girls. When he stopped to help, he was stunned to discover who she was. The evening sun dipped slowly over the city, casting golden hues on the buildings. The hum of urban life filled the air, car horns, snippets of conversations, and the constant drone of engines blended into a chaotic symphony. Amid this bustling energy, a woman moved slowly, almost dragging her feet. Her name was Sarah, her pale skin and weary eyes revealing the endless exhaustion that weighed on her. Beside her walked two little girls, her precious treasures, the only light in her otherwise dark world. The twins were nearly identical, with curly chestnut hair and inquisitive expressions, though hunger had muted their usual liveliness. Sarah felt a lump in her throat, not just from the pangs of hunger, but from the relentless pressure of trying to care for her daughters in a world that seemed to have turned its back on them. It had been months since they lost their home. The modest apartment she rented with her earnings from cleaning houses was taken away by the landlord when she could no longer pay. Sarah had tried everything, seeking extra work, asking friends for help, even considering a loan. But every door seemed to slam shut. Now she wandered aimlessly, hoping to find shelter or at least a place to rest for a while. The girls didn't fully understand what was happening, though they were beginning to sense it. They no longer asked about their home or their father as often as they used to, and it seemed they had grown accustomed to this uncertain new reality. Yet, a glimmer of hope still sparkled in their eyes. They believed their mother would find a way. "Mom, are we going to eat today?" asked the younger twin, Susan, tugging softly at Sarah's hand. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hide the pain that grew heavier with each passing day. She knelt down in front of Susan, looked her in the eyes, and forced a smile, though her face betrayed her sadness. "Very soon, sweetheart. We'll find something, I promise. Mommy always finds a way." Deep down, Sarah felt her strength fading. The backpack she carried, filled with their few belongings, seemed heavier than ever. She glanced around, desperately searching for a kind face or even a faint sign of hope. But the city, with all its noise and activity, remained indifferent to her suffering. The streets grew busier as they neared the city center. At every corner, bustling restaurants overflowed with people in expensive suits, window displays showcased flawless mannequins, and luxury cars zipped by just inches from the sidewalk. It was a different world, one Sarah no longer belonged to. As she crossed a busy intersection, something caught her eye. On the opposite side of the street stood a sleek, shiny sports car. Leaning against it was a tall man in a dark suit and expensive sunglasses. His confident posture made him stand out from the crowd. Mark. His name immediately surfaced in Sarah's mind. In that moment, it felt as if the entire world froze. Sarah's surroundings faded, leaving only his face, the face she had tried to erase from her memory for years. Mark was part of her past. Their relationship had been intense, full of passion and turbulence. Mark was the center of Sarah's universe, but one day, he vanished without a word, no explanation, no goodbye, leaving behind only silence. Sarah was left with a broken heart and shattered promises. Soon after, she discovered she was pregnant. The twin girls, who inherited so many of their father's features, were constant reminders of him. Sarah had never told Mark about the children. Fear, confusion, and eventually resentment kept her secret locked away. Mark, casually checking his phone, suddenly looked up. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, connected with Sarah's and then shifted to the girls standing beside her. Something about them caught his attention and wouldn't let go. Slowly, he removed his sunglasses and looked again, this time more carefully. The girls. There was something in their faces, their hair, their eyes, even the way they moved, that stirred a memory of his own childhood. The realization hit him like a wave. Could they really be mine? The thought struck deep. Mark frowned, trying to rationalize it, but the resemblance felt too uncanny to dismiss as coincidence. So much time had passed since he'd last seen Sarah. Although their relationship had ended abruptly, he never imagined she might be raising his children without his knowledge. Mark, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, felt his grip on that control slipping. Since building his business empire, his life had revolved around work, investments, and expanding his wealth. Love, let alone family, had no place in his meticulously planned schedule. Women came and went, leaving no mark because he never allowed them to stay long enough to leave one. But now, seeing these girls, who might be his, something shifted within him. Sarah tried to keep walking, even as her heart raced wildly. She knew Mark had recognized her, and she understood that avoiding him wasn't an option for much longer. The girls bore too much of his likeness. The truth was written all over their faces, and sooner or later, Mark would demand answers. At the next crosswalk, Sarah stopped. She couldn't keep going. The girls clung to her skirt, their small hands trembling with exhaustion, much like her own spirit. She scanned her surroundings, desperate for a way out, but it seemed fate had already decided the course. Across the street, Mark stood frozen, his gaze fixed on them. Something inside him pushed him forward, even though he didn't yet have the words or the plan. He knew this moment could alter everything. For years, he'd avoided any kind of commitment, but now, it seemed he had no choice. Determined, Mark crossed the street, but as he got closer, his usual confidence began to waver. And when he was near enough, he saw the fatigue etched into Sarah's face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the sadness she struggled to hide behind a faint smile. Sarah, he murmured her name, as if calling back a ghost from his past. She looked up at him. Her eyes were filled with pain and surprise. She had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed what she might say if she ever saw him again. But now, as he stood in front of her, every word she had practiced vanished. All that remained was silence and the weight of an untold story. Mark glanced down at the girls. He wanted to ask something but couldn't bring himself to speak. The answer was staring back at him, in the eyes of the two little girls who looked at him with curiosity. "Yes," Sarah said softly, barely above a whisper. "They're your daughters." Mark felt his chest tighten at those words. Sarah's simple, straightforward response left him frozen. The two small girls who curiously observed him, unaware of the tension in the air, were his children. Twins. The echo of that word bounced around in his mind, an uncomfortable truth he couldn't ignore. Never in his wildest thoughts had he imagined this moment, especially not with Sarah, the woman who had once been the center of his world. Sarah studied Mark's face, searching for any reaction beyond the shock that was so clear. She had known this moment would come, but she never expected it to feel this heavy. Relief and fear clashed inside her. Relief because the truth was finally out. Fear, because she had no idea how Mark would take it. The years had been unkind to Sarah. Since Mark had left her life, everything had been an uphill battle. Raising her daughters alone, without any help, had pushed her to the brink. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificing everything to give them a better life. But life had been merciless. Every choice, every sacrifice seemed to pull her further away from the stability she desperately sought. And now, standing before Mark, she felt as though all her struggles were about to be judged. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mark finally asked. His voice was low, laced with a mix of disbelief and reproach. He couldn't fathom how Sarah had kept something so monumental from him, something that would have turned his world upside down. Sarah lowered her gaze, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She had played this moment over in her head so many times, but she hadn't imagined how hard it would actually be. "I didn't know how," she said quietly. "When you left, I had no way to reach you, and later, I was just too scared. I didn't know if you'd even want to know. I didn't know if you'd be happy. Or maybe, once you found out, you'd just disappear again." Mark felt a lump forming in his throat. Sarah's simple words hit him like a harsh dose of reality he had never even considered. He had left Sarah behind. There was no denying it. His relentless pursuit of a career and success had distanced him from any emotional ties. "I didn't know I had kids," he said more softly this time, his voice tinged with regret. "I didn't know this was happening." She raised her gaze, her unshed tears glimmering in her eyes. "But you didn't even try to find out, Mark. You didn't even try to come back. Not once." Her words struck Mark harder than he had anticipated. A man used to controlling every aspect of his life, always making calculated decisions, suddenly realized how blinded he had been by his ego and ambition. He had never looked back, never thought about the impact his absence might have had on Sarah. And now, faced with the reality of fatherhood, guilt began to gnaw at him from the inside out. Mark took a deep breath, observing the scene unfolding before him. The girls, oblivious to the tension between the adults, began fidgeting. The youngest, Lily, tugged at her sister's hand, trying to get her attention. "Mommy, can we go home?" she asked with the innocent curiosity only a child could possess. That simple question landed like a punch to the gut. Their mother gently stroked her daughter's cheek, hiding the truth behind her eyes because she had no answer to give. Mark, too, caught that moment, a brief glimpse of the weight Sarah carried. Not only had he just discovered he was a father, but it was clear Sarah and the girls didn't have a stable home. The harsh reality of it all hit him with an unexpected force. "Mommy," Lily repeated, and her sister, Anna, tugged at their mother's sleeve, sensing the unease in the air. Mark watched the interaction closely. As a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by wealth and comfort, Mark was suddenly confronted with a world he had never truly seen. One filled with vulnerability and struggle. He crouched down, attempting to connect with the girls. "What are your names?" he asked gently, trying to bridge the gap between them. "I'm Lily," the youngest replied timidly, a faint smile breaking through. "And this is my sister Anna." Their names echoed in Mark's mind, as though saying them out loud made him acknowledge a part of his life he had long ignored. He straightened up and looked back at Sarah. "Where are you staying?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sarah let out a heavy sigh. She knew there was no point in hiding the truth any longer. "We're getting by. Sometimes we find shelter, sometimes we sleep wherever we can. It's not easy, Mark. I'm doing the best I can. But every day it gets harder." Mark felt a hollow ache forming within him. For the first time in his life, something beyond work, beyond his familiar comfort zone, had shaken him to his core. He looked at Sarah and the girls again. He realized that walking away wasn't an option this time. Not now. Not like this. "Come with me," he said finally, his voice steady but tinged with emotions he didn't yet fully understand. "You can't live like this. I'll take you somewhere safe." Sarah glanced at him skeptically. She hadn't expected this response. For years, she had pictured Mark learning the truth and simply turning his back on her. She had convinced herself he wouldn't care about her or the girls. But now, his offer of help left her feeling unbalanced. She knew she couldn't say no, not for herself, but for her children. The girls deserved more than she could give them alone. Mark pulled out his car keys and looked at her with quiet determination. "Get in. We need to get out of here." Battling a mix of relief and fear, Sarah took the girls by the hand and led them toward the car. She had no idea what lay ahead, but for now, her only thought was the safety of her daughters. They climbed into the car. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt the faintest glimmer of hope, that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The engine of the luxurious car roared to life, and Mark steered them down the city's glowing streets. Inside the car, however, there was silence. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. In the back seat, the girls, worn out from a long day, had fallen asleep, curled up together. Mark kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were miles away. Every so often, he glanced at the rearview mirror to see the girls, now peacefully sleeping. His daughters. Twins. The realization struck him deeply. He couldn't find a simple explanation for the whirlwind of emotions he was feeling: amazement, guilt, and a gnawing sense of responsibility. A man who had always avoided commitment suddenly found himself facing a family he had never asked for but now couldn't ignore. When the car finally pulled up in front of his house, Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Outside, the mansion was bathed in warm lights, revealing a manicured lawn and neatly trimmed trees. This was a completely different world, far removed from the harsh reality she had faced in recent years. Mark turned off the engine and looked at Sarah. His expression had shifted, his usual guarded demeanor replaced by something more open and genuine. "We're here. The girls can rest here. Tonight, you don't have to worry about anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sarah nodded silently, though she felt completely out of place. It was as if she were stepping into a life she had only ever glimpsed from the outside, one she never thought she could belong to. Mark stepped out of the car and walked to the back door to help with the girls. He cautiously, but somewhat clumsily, picked up Susan in his arms, as if he were holding a child for the first time. Sarah did the same with Mary, feeling her warm yet exhausted body. Together, they climbed the marble staircase toward the main entrance. There, they were greeted by a middle-aged man in an impeccably pressed uniform. "Everything is ready for your guests," he said calmly, giving Mark a slight nod. Mark responded with a brief nod. "Take our things to the west wing," he instructed before entering the house. Sarah followed behind, her eyes taking in the spacious interior. Everywhere she looked, there were expensive paintings, gleaming floors, and crystal chandeliers. She felt even more out of place in this lavish environment. Her struggles and pain seemed to have no place here. "The girls can rest here," Mark said, pointing to a large, bright room that looked like something straight out of a storybook. Soft, neatly folded blankets were arranged on the bed, and long velvet curtains framed the windows. Sarah gently laid Mary on one of the beds. Mark did the same, though it was clear he wasn't used to this. They stood in silence for a while, watching the girls fall into a peaceful sleep, completely unaware of the worries that had consumed their parents throughout the day. "Are you sure this is the right thing to do?" Mark asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Sarah looked at him, surprised. Mark, what are you talking about? I'm not used to this. I don't know how to handle this, he confessed. For the first time, she heard vulnerability in his voice, something she had never noticed before. I didn't expect this either. Children, and you, living like this. I just don't know what the right thing to do is. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure whether to feel relief from his honesty or become even more cautious. I don't know either, she whispered. For so many years, I've just been surviving. I forgot what it was like to actually live. But these girls, they're everything to me. They're the only thing that matters. Mark nodded in understanding. I get it, he said, listening carefully to her words. And I will try to make things right. Then prove it, Sarah said, lowering her voice. Not with words, but with actions. Mark nodded, fully realizing that now, he would have to do things he had never done before, build his life on something more than success and money. Let them rest, he said softly. We'll talk tomorrow, he added, pointing toward the door. Sarah silently agreed. She knew that difficult decisions were waiting for them ahead. As they left the room, Mark quietly closed the door and turned to her. You need to rest too. I can have a room prepared for you if you want. Sarah shook her head. No, I'll stay with them. I can't leave them alone in a strange place. All right, Mark agreed. In the morning, we'll discuss everything. He glanced at her one more time before heading to his own suite. Sarah stood silently in the hallway, leaning against the wall, letting out a heavy sigh. She knew that many questions lay ahead, ones that needed answers. But, at least, her daughters were safe. And that was all that mattered. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the heavy curtains of the mansion, filling the room with a soft glow. The girls were still asleep. Their small bodies were snuggled warmly in soft blankets. Sarah had been awake for a while but hadn't gotten up. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady breathing of her daughters while replaying the events of the past day in her mind. She was in Mark's house, the man who had broken her heart, but now seemed to be the only one offering her help. It was ironic and terrifying at the same time. For years, she had learned to rely only on herself, trusting no one, and now everything had turned upside down. It felt as though the very walls of this house reminded her of the vast divide between their worlds. A world where she had to fight for every scrap, and a world that seemed built on endless wealth and comfort. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. The butler entered with a perfectly polite smile. Good morning, he said softly. Mark Viktorovich has asked me to prepare breakfast for you and your children. They're waiting for you in the dining room when you're ready. Sarah nodded, surprised by the unexpected kindness. Thank you, she said quietly. After the butler left, Sarah slowly approached her daughters' beds and began waking them up. Susan was the first to open her eyes and smile. Mom, this bed is so soft, she whispered, snuggling deeper into the blanket. Mary followed her sister's lead, still half asleep. Sarah smiled at her daughters, but deep down, she felt torn. She knew this was just a temporary relief. She helped the girls get dressed, reminded of how little they had left. It was such a stark contrast to the luxury that surrounded them. When they made their way downstairs to the spacious dining room, Mark was already waiting at the long wooden table. He looked at them with a warm smile, although Sarah noticed something deeper in his eyes, perhaps uncertainty or even guilt. The girls, a bit shy yet excited, slowly approached the table. Good morning, Mark said, his voice gentle, though it was clear he was trying to ease the tension. Good morning, the girls replied quietly, taking their seats. Sarah lingered a bit longer, her gaze intense, as though trying to figure out Mark's true intentions. The breakfast was lavish, fresh fruit, hot bread, juices, and dishes the girls had never seen before. They ate with visible enjoyment, their eyes sparkling with joy. Mark watched them silently, taking in every detail. For him, a man accustomed to fine dining, this moment felt especially poignant. Suddenly, Mark realized that these girls, his daughters, were enjoying what had always seemed ordinary to him. After a brief pause, he turned his gaze to Sarah. Sarah, he began, his voice steady yet friendly. I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday, and I want to discuss what comes next. Sarah put down her fork and looked at him intently. She knew this conversation was inevitable. All right, she replied, signaling that she was ready to listen. Mark took a sip of his coffee before continuing. I know I left you in a very difficult situation, and I'm not going to pretend that it's not my fault. But I can't change the past. The only thing I can do now is try to provide a better future for you. Sarah narrowed her eyes, keeping her emotions in check. His words sounded sincere, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to trust him. And what exactly are you proposing? She asked cautiously. Mark paused for a moment before responding. I want you to stay here, at least for now, while we figure out a long-term solution. This house is safe, and it has everything you need. I can't let you end up on the streets again. Sarah felt a mixture of emotions, relief and hesitation. Stay here, she repeated thoughtfully, her voice shaking slightly. It sounds tempting, but I can't just depend on you, Mark. Not after everything that's happened. Mark met her gaze, his expression serious. I'm not asking you to depend on me. I'm just offering help. For the girls. They deserve better than what they had. Mark's words were convincing, and Sarah knew he was right. Her daughters did deserve better. After a long silence, she sighed and quietly said, All right, we'll stay, but only for a while, until I can figure everything out. Mark nodded affirmatively, accepting her decision. That's all I'm asking, he replied. In that moment, a fragile truce seemed to settle between them. It was delicate, but perhaps this was the first step toward something more. The day at the mansion passed in a strange silence, as if the atmosphere itself was adjusting to the new residents. The girls eagerly explored the enormous house, their laughter echoing through the halls as they ran through the garden, hid behind neatly trimmed bushes, and played tag among the trees. Sarah watched them, seeing how their faces lit up with happiness, something so rare in recent months. But she still felt out of place. This house, this life, everything about it felt foreign. She knew this was temporary, but even this brief time with Mark stirred up so many old feelings and questions. On his part, Mark was making an effort to show that his interest wasn't just about business and money. He spent more time with the girls, watching them play, and sometimes even trying to join in. Sarah saw him awkwardly trying to play with them, his movements a bit stiff. She couldn't deny that Mark was genuinely trying. But there was still an invisible barrier between them. Just as the girls ran out of the garden, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Mark. They're happy, he said quietly, watching the girls run around in the yard. They've always been happy, no matter what, the mother replied, keeping her gaze on the children. All I ever wanted for them was a life free of the struggles I had to face. Mark stayed silent, thinking about her words. He found it hard to imagine what Sarah had gone through raising 3 kids on her own. I'm trying to change, he finally said, his voice firm. I know I've made mistakes, but I don't want to stay the person I was. Sarah turned to face him, her expression wary. I hear your words, but I don't know if I can let myself trust you again. The girls see you as their father, but you have to prove that you can be one. Not with words, but with actions. Mark nodded, accepting her words. He understood that earning her trust wouldn't be easy. I will, he answered briefly, but with certainty. Their conversation was interrupted by the joyful shouts of the girls. Susan tripped and fell onto the grass. Sarah rushed to her, picking her up and gently wiping away the small scrape. It's okay, my girl, she softly said, kissing Susan on the forehead. Mark approached them, but Susan, still crying, instinctively clung to Sarah. Only her mother could comfort her. This moment hit Mark hard. He realized how distant he was from these children, even though they were his own. Sorry, he muttered more to himself than to Sarah. The mother stood up holding Susan in her arms. It's fine, she said, her voice calm. It's nothing. She'll forget about it soon, Sarah added, trying to reassure him. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. He was someone used to solving problems with money and influence, and he suddenly understood that those tools were useless here. When they returned to the house, the girls immediately got distracted by the treats waiting for them in the dining room. Mark watched them from a distance, feeling a strange warmth from their happiness. You're a good mother, he suddenly said, turning to Sarah. His voice was sincere. I don't know how you did it, but you managed alone. And they're happy. That's the most important thing. Sarah looked at him in surprise. I didn't have a choice, she answered honestly. I had to keep going, for them. Mark nodded. Now I have to prove I can be part of their lives. Sarah didn't answer, but her gaze softened. That evening at dinner, the girls, full of energy, eagerly talked about their new adventures in the garden. Mark listened to them with a rare, genuine smile. He felt that this moment was one of the most significant of his life. Sarah, sitting across from him, still seemed guarded. But for the first time in a long while, she began to believe that something might actually change. The next morning, everything in the house seemed peaceful, but inside Sarah, a sense of unease was growing. She woke up earlier than the girls and sat for a long time, looking out the window at the neatly trimmed bushes in the garden. She felt torn. On one hand, she was relieved that the girls were finally safe, away from the streets and uncertainty. On the other hand, there was Mark. The man who had once left her alone, now trying to be part of their lives, but could she trust him? The girls woke up full of energy and soon started making noise as they got ready for breakfast. They were happy, and that gave Sarah some comfort. When they came downstairs, Mark was already waiting for them. This time, he looked a little tense, which Sarah immediately noticed. After breakfast, when the girls ran off to play in the garden, Mark carefully approached Sarah. "I thought it might be nice for the girls to get out for a bit," he began. "I was thinking of taking them to the park." Sarah looked up at him. She hadn't expected the suggestion, but it seemed reasonable. "Okay," she replied briefly. "I think they'll enjoy it." The drive to the park was calm, though there was a slight awkwardness between Sarah and Mark in the car. The girls, on the other hand, were excited and chattered enthusiastically about what they would do in the park. As soon as the car stopped, the girls quickly ran outside and headed for the playground. Sarah and Mark stayed nearby, watching them. "They adapt so quickly," Mark observed, watching the girls laughing and sliding down the slide. "They're just kids," Sarah replied quietly, her voice holding a trace of pain. "They don't understand what it's like to be broken inside." Mark frowned slightly, her words hitting him hard. "I'm trying to fix everything," he said after a long pause. "I know it's not easy, but I want to be a part of their lives." Sarah didn't respond right away. Her gaze remained fixed on the girls. "It's not just about them, Mark," she finally said. "You were part of my life, and you broke it. I'm still not sure if I can let you back into our lives." Her words were direct and painful, but Mark knew she was right. The silence between them lasted a while. Until Sarah noticed a girl on the playground tangled in some ropes. Mark immediately rushed over to help her, acting surprisingly deftly for someone who had once avoided such situations. When he returned, his expression turned serious. "They deserve better," he said, looking her in the eyes. "I know," she replied. "And that's why I need to be sure that you're ready to do things the right way, not just now, but moving forward." After their outing at the park, the girls were happy and tired. They chatted away, carefree, debating who was faster on the slide and who swung higher on the swings. Mark smiled quietly, listening to their conversation. But Sarah remained on edge. Even though she could see how hard Mark was trying to connect with the girls, she couldn't shake the feeling that he might disappear again, just like before. When they returned to the mansion, the girls quickly ran to their rooms to play. Sarah stayed downstairs, silently watching as Mark removed his jacket and settled into a chair in the living room. "You look exhausted," she noted, sitting across from him. "It's a little unusual," he admitted, glancing at her. "I'm not used to spending time with kids." Sarah nodded quietly. "They need more than just a day at the park, Mark. They deserve stability. I need to be sure you can give that to them." Mark leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. "I know my words don't mean much right now," he said, his voice serious. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to give them the best." Sarah studied him, trying to gauge how sincere he was. "Okay," she said finally. "Then we'll start with small steps." Mark smiled. "Sounds like a plan." That evening at dinner, the girls once again filled the house with laughter. They excitedly talked about their fun at the park and discussed plans for a picnic in the garden the next day. Mark listened, genuinely happy that he was bringing joy to his daughters. Sarah, watching them, felt herself softening a little. She saw that he was trying. But it wasn't enough to regain her trust. The next morning, the girls woke up earlier than usual, excited for the day ahead. Susan was the first to rush out of her room to find her mom. "Mom, let's go somewhere again today," Susan shouted. "We'll need to talk to Mark first, but if he takes us, of course, we'll go," her mother replied. Mark overheard the conversation and immediately offered, "Of course, girls, I'll take you wherever you want. How about a picnic?" "Yay!" the girls cheered. As the day outdoors came to an end, the girls, tired but happy, slowly made their way back to the car. Their faces were glowing with joy. Sarah noticed how tightly Susan was holding Mark's hand, as if she was starting to feel safe with him. When they returned to the mansion, the girls dashed to their room, already planning their next adventure. Sarah stayed downstairs to have a conversation with Mark. "Everything went well today," she said. But Mark, you need to understand, one good day doesn't change everything. Mark nodded, his gaze dropping. I know, he admitted. But I want them to know that I'm here, he added. And that's not enough, Sarah replied. Her tone was soft but firm. Being here is easy, but you have to show them that you can stay, no matter what. Mark paused, understanding that she needed more than just his words. But how could he prove that when his past still seemed to pull him back? Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a doorbell. Sarah flinched, and Mark frowned. I'll get it, he said, standing up. At the door stood a tall man in a sharp suit. It was Mark's old business partner. You're always on time, Mark said flatly, gesturing for him to come inside. Sarah immediately sensed that this visit was important. She stepped back, watching the two men head toward the office. For almost an hour, she could hear muffled voices from behind the door. The conversation seemed to grow more intense. At one point, she heard Mark raise his voice. You can't just leave all of this in the past. It doesn't work that way. I'm not trying to, Mark shot back sharply. But I won't let it destroy my family. Those words made Sarah freeze. What were they talking about? When the door finally opened, Mark quickly left, nodding a brief goodbye to Sarah. His face was grim, and his steps were quick. Mark followed behind, his face tense. He stopped in front of Sarah, but didn't speak right away. What did you talk about? She asked, her voice steady but cautious. It's not important, Mark replied, avoiding the question. Sarah stared at him, her eyes flashing with anger. If it affects me or the girls, it's important. Mark sighed. I'll handle it, he said. I promise. Your promises don't mean anything to me anymore, Sarah replied coldly. I want to know the truth. Mark looked at her. His eyes were filled with conflicting emotions. Give me some time. I'll tell you everything, but right now, I just can't. She turned away, feeling the growing mistrust. You don't have much time, Mark. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Sarah sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the darkening garden. Her thoughts were heavy and restless. The conversation with Mark and his evasive answers triggered old fears in Sarah. She began to realize that his past might be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. But what exactly was he hiding? And how could it affect their future? The door creaked open softly, and Mark appeared in the doorway. Can I come in? He asked cautiously, looking at her. Sarah nodded without turning. I thought we needed to talk. He started, walking in and closing the door behind him. Sarah didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on the window. You're angry, he said after a pause. Of course I'm angry, Sarah replied, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were filled with exhaustion and fury. You're hiding something again. How can I trust you if you're not telling me the truth? Mark sighed heavily and sat across from her. It's not as simple as you think, he said. There are things from the past. They could hurt not just me. Sarah tensed, her attention sharpening. Not directly, he added quickly. But there are people who might try to use my past against me. And it could affect you? Sarah frowned, her hands clenched into fists. You should have told me this sooner. I know, Mark admitted. I was trying to protect you, but maybe I did it wrong. Sarah smiled faintly. Mark lowered his head. You understand that excuses won't work anymore. Mark, he's my old partner, he began. We worked together on a few projects. Not all of them were clean. I thought I'd left that behind. But apparently, he decided to remind me of it. And you're telling me that this could threaten us? Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. I won't let that happen. Mark answered firmly. I'll do everything to make sure you're safe. Sarah stood up and started pacing the room. Her steps were agitated. I don't know if I can believe this. How many more secrets are you hiding from me? He stood up and walked over to her. I know I've earned your mistrust. But I want to fix this. I'm ready to tell you everything. Just give me time. Sarah stopped and looked at him. You really don't have much time, she said. Mark nodded, knowing that every move he made would now be under scrutiny. The next day, the tension in the house was palpable, even in the smallest of details. Sarah tried to avoid unnecessary conversations with Mark, focusing on the girls who were happily playing in the garden. Mark, for his part, was quiet and pensive. He knew that every minute of silence only deepened Sarah's mistrust. By lunchtime, he finally made up his mind. Finding Sarah in the living room, he approached her. We need to talk, he said, his face serious. Sarah looked at him. About what? About how you're hiding something again. Mark nodded. About the past and what I should have told you right away. She motioned for him to sit without saying a word. All right, I'm listening. Her voice was cold and distant. Mark took a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. When Mark and I worked together, I didn't realize right away that some of his methods were illegal. It was about financial schemes. Investments that weren't exactly transparent. When I found out, I decided to back out, but it wasn't that simple. Sarah listened intently. Her face remained calm, but the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. Walking away meant leaving behind some projects and, along with them, a part of my reputation, he continued. Mark didn't take it well. He's been holding a grudge ever since, and now he's back again. He's back? She asked. Yes, Mark replied. He wants me to join one of his schemes again, threatening to expose my past if I refuse. Sarah exhaled slowly, trying to process what she'd just heard. And what are you going to do? She asked. I already told him no, Mark said firmly. But I know he might try other ways to get to me. I won't let him hurt you. Why didn't you tell me this before? Sarah's voice wavered. I was scared, Mark admitted. Afraid you'd push me away again. She gazed out the window thoughtfully. You still don't understand, Mark, she finally said. I can't rely on someone who keeps secrets about something this important. Mark lowered his head, unable to argue with her. I'll change, he said quietly. But I need time to prove it. Sarah stared at him silently, her expression tense. I'll give you a chance, she said at last. But only for the girls. Mark felt a small wave of relief but also knew this was just the beginning of a long road to rebuilding her trust. Days passed slowly. Despite his promise, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his past still loomed over him. Every message or phone call filled him with anxiety. He knew Mark wouldn't stop at threats, but his greatest fear was the harm it could bring to Sarah and the girls. Sarah, on the other hand, tried to focus on their daily routines. She spent more time with the girls, watching them laugh and play in the yard. Yet deep down, she couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that Mark wasn't being entirely honest. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Sarah came downstairs to speak with him. Mark was sitting at his desk, poring over documents but looking distracted. Mark, she said, getting his attention. He looked up at her. We need to talk, she continued. He set the papers aside and motioned for her to sit down. What's wrong? He asked. You still seem so tense, she said. You're trying to act like everything's under control, but I can tell it's not, she said. Mark let out a heavy sigh. I don't want this to affect you, he admitted. Mark might try to use my past against me, but I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. This isn't just about us, Mark. Her voice was firm. You need to deal with this not just for us, but for yourself too. Her words gave him pause. She was right. He couldn't just keep running, he had to sever the ties that connected him to Mark completely. What do you want me to do? He finally asked. Be honest, Sarah replied. If you're serious about starting fresh, you need to stop running from your problems. Mark sat in silence, mulling over her words. I'll talk to Mark, he said at last. I'll make it clear that I won't let him pull me into his schemes again. All right, Sarah nodded. But remember, Mark, this is your last chance. He looked at her intently, and a flicker of determination appeared in his eyes. I won't let you down, he promised. The next day, Mark headed into town to confront Mark. He knew the conversation wouldn't be easy, but he could no longer let fear control his life. Sarah stayed home with the girls, trying not to think about what might happen. Deep down, she understood that the outcome of this conversation would determine not only Mark's future but also the safety of their family. When Mark returned that evening, he looked exhausted, but there was a new confidence in his eyes. Is everything okay? Sarah asked, meeting him in the hallway. Yes, he replied. I'm not tied to Mark anymore. I made it clear he can't manipulate me. Sarah studied him carefully. Are you sure? Absolutely, Mark said firmly. It's all on us now. She nodded, feeling, for the first time, that he was truly ready to turn his life around. Weeks passed, and life in the house started to feel more settled. Sarah grew accustomed to having Mark around, and she noticed how hard he worked to build a bond with the girls and take care of her too. Every day, the girls would run to greet him as soon as he returned home, their laughter filling the house with warmth that had been missing for so long. Slowly, Sarah began to feel a sense of calm return to their lives. Mark seemed genuinely committed to leaving his past behind. He was attentive, caring, and made an effort to be present, not just for the girls but for her as well. One evening after dinner, while the girls played in the living room, Sarah and Mark stayed out on the porch. "You know," Sarah said, gazing at the stars. "A few months ago, I couldn't have imagined us sitting here like this." "Me neither," Mark replied with a small smile. "Back then, everything felt so complicated." She turned to him, her expression soft. "But you're trying, and I can see that." "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the girls' excited voices as they ran onto the patio. "Mom, Dad, will you play with us?" Susan asked, grabbing their hands. "Of course, we're coming." Mark laughed as he stood up. Sarah smiled too, watching the genuine joy on the girls' faces as they embraced Mark's presence. One afternoon, Mark suggested they have a picnic in the park. The girls were thrilled with the idea, and Sarah busied herself preparing food. When they arrived at a clearing in the woods, the girls ran off immediately, collecting flowers and chasing butterflies. Mark helped Sarah spread out the blankets and unpack the picnic basket. "It feels like we've stepped out of reality for a moment," she said, watching the girls. "That's a feeling worth holding on to," he replied softly. Sarah glanced at him and, for the first time in a long while, felt a glimmer of hope that their future could be bright. After lunch, Mark began telling the girls stories from his childhood. They listened intently, laughing and peppering him with questions. Sarah watched the scene unfold, realizing Mark had become someone the girls had always needed, a father. That evening, after they returned home and the girls were asleep, Sarah stopped Mark in the hallway. "Thank you for today," she said. "It really was a good day," he replied. She gave him a thoughtful look. "I can see how hard you're trying. Maybe, I'm ready to give you another chance." He froze, his eyes lighting up with hope. "You have no idea how much that means to me," he said softly. Sarah smiled, feeling a weight lift from her heart. One evening, Mark suggested they watch an old movie together. The girls excitedly piled into the living room, curling up on the couch. Sarah sat down beside Mark, who instinctively rested his hand on her knee. At first, she tensed, but then allowed herself to relax. When the movie ended, Susan beamed and said, "This was the best night ever." Sarah and Mark exchanged smiles. "There will be plenty more nights like this," Mark said, gently stroking his daughter's hair. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Sarah reflected on how far they had come. She realized she hadn't fully forgiven Mark yet, but her heart was no longer resistant to the idea. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said. Mark entered, holding a cup of tea. "I thought you might want this," he said, offering it to her. Sarah smiled. "Thank you." He sat across from her, watching her face. "You look at peace," he noted. "I'm just thinking about us, and the girls," she replied. "I know things aren't perfect yet," he said. "But I feel like we're on the right track." "Maybe," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. Day by day, their bond grew stronger. Mark continued to show he had changed, and Sarah started to believe they might truly have a chance at happiness. Thank you for sticking with this story until the end. Share your thoughts on Sarah and Mark's journey in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with your friends and loved ones. It inspires us to keep creating new stories every day. Stay tuned for the next incredible tale, coming to your screen soon. We're so grateful to have you with us. Check out the catalog linked in the description below.